To say that George R.R. Martin has an unconventional take on fantasy, which I think be a little bit of an understatement. He's definitely done some things in the fantasy genre that other people have done before in different ways, but he sort of turned everything on its head in, the 90s when A Song of Ice and Fire first started becoming a thing. And then once it became mainstream in the modern era with HBO's Game of Thrones show, I think people began to realize that, oh, we can do a lot of different things with fantasy. It doesn't have to be carbon copies of Tolkien every single time. I think the watershed moment for many people was watching the Red Wedding play out on the small screen. And for those of us who had read the books prior to watching the show, we all knew what was coming, and we're just kind of watching the room, kind of waiting to see what everyone was going to think and how they were going to react, because we knew that, oh my God, he has done these things that other writers don't do. Like, he's killing off beloved characters, and he's it's a tale of vengeance and blood and cutthroat morals and rape and incest and all this other stuff. And that was not what so many people had become accustomed to over the years from fantasy authors. This is a really interesting interview. It's an old interview from years ago when Game of Thrones was first becoming a big thing on HBO. But I think it's a pretty interesting take on his relationship with fantasy and how he views Tolkien, but also how he sees how fantasy has played out. And I think this is an important conversation to have in the scope of everything that's been happening in the recent years. Obviously, we have culture wars going on right now with people who think that there's woke agendas in fantasy and all this other stuff. We're going to be covering George R. R. Martin's take on the woke agenda in a future video, so make sure to stay tuned for that. But that's not what this video is about. This video is about sort of the generic nature of fantasy and how everybody since Tolkien has created some version or another of that Tolkien universe. And that's why, for many people, it feels like fantasy is stale. You get a lot of people say that, and I don't agree with this, but let's get this out in the open first and foremost. A lot of people will say that Tolkien created the best fantasy world ever. I don't necessarily think that's the case. I do think, as Martin says here in this interview, that Tolkien did establish a foundation layer and, without question, created a world that was very interesting, unique, and definitely was a masterclass writer. But I think that there have been other authors who have done it equally well. Brian Herbert, as an example, not exactly fantasy, but still world building of that caliber. I would argue that George R. R. Martin himself, Robert Jordan, Tad Williams, Terry Goodkind, and I'm not saying whether or not you like their styles or the messages that you put in or took away from their writings, but the world building itself. I think there's a lot of authors since then who have done unique things with their worlds. But I don't want to make this all about me. I think this is a very interesting interview, and I kind of wanted to go through and listen to what George R. R. Martin had to say. We're 3 minutes in, and I haven't even gotten to it yet. So without further ado, let's sit down and kind of work through this one section of the interview where he's talking about how fantasy is changing.
It is a brutal world that you've created. People die. Um, Families are ruined. It's war. I mean, we are in war when we're reading A Song of Ice and Fire. That is different than a lot of fantasy fiction.
It is different. However, I would also argue that Tolkien himself, if you read, I'm doing a reread right now with the Mondays in Middle Earth series. There's a lot of war happening in the Lord of the Rings in those books. Everything is about Sauron bringing his armies against the forces of good. And Tolkien's experience in the war led him to write some very interesting and really detailed war scenarios, whether it's the battle on Helm's Deep, the Riders of Rohan charging into the Battle of Pelennor Fields. I mean, there's a lot of like literal war scenarios that unfold in the Lord of the Rings, but they're just not written in a visceral way like what George R. R. Martin did. So this is an important takeaway from this interview here.
Yes.
What difference is that to you? And you embrace the fantasy genre, but those qualities are different than many fantasy books.
I will say that fantasy is changing, and maybe I had some small part in it changing. If you read some of the younger fantasy writers who have come along in the last 5 years or so, I think their work reflects more of a realism. But the modern fantasy largely grew out of the work of J.R.R. Tolkien and his great
which
landmark
is
Lord of the
absolutely
Rings,
true.
which looms over all fantasy like a mountain, and everybody else is operating in the shadow of Tolkien and what
That's
he did.
also true.
And my admiration for Tolkien and his work is second to none. I think Lord of the Rings is one of the great novels of the 20th
One of
century,
the
perhaps
great
the greatest
novels.
novel of the 20th century, as it was voted recently by the readers of the Guardian, I think, in
Mm-hmm.
England, to the fury of some of the people in the literary establishment who wanted it to go to like James Joyce or Nabokov or somebody, and instead it went to Tolkien. But that being said, following Lord of the Rings, fantasy was largely taken over by Tolkien imitators who were delivering Tolkien like books, but who didn't seem to capture any of the power of Tolkien and just were borrowing some of his tropes. And some of the things that Tolkien did, which I think worked for him, in the hands of these lesser writers, developed into pretty bad cliches. And the whole thing
Mm-hmm.
of the Dark Lord is stirring, and
So I got to stop right here because I think this is a very poignant example of what we see in most books and most series, most films that we've seen since. Now, I don't, like I said, everybody's kind of operating in this mentality of we're under Tolkien's shadow. The mountain that is Lord of the Rings looms above everything, and so everything is written in and under the shadow of that mountain. But what he says here is very important because he says in the hands of lesser writers, these ideas don't necessarily come across as powerfully as they did with Tolkien. Things like, we see these played out over and over. The Dark Lord, um, his minions. He goes on to talk about this in a little bit, and we'll probably play through that part where he talks about, bad guys wear black, good guys wear white. Um, and I would argue that we often see sort of these sugary sweet versions of Tolkien where the good guys always win, the bad guys always lose. There's not a lot of sacrifice, and it's I would call it popcorn fare. It's not bad. It's just not at that level of critical. No amount of critical thinking is necessary. I had somebody come on one of my videos recently because I've been watching Willow and I enjoy Willow the show. A lot of people were pooping all over it, and I come back and I always say, well, that's because you've let your inner child die, and you haven't allowed your inner child to survive, and so it's smothered and withered and died, and so you don't find enjoyment in things. And there's someone made a comment that there's a difference between needing to switch off your brain to enjoy something or just enjoying something because it's meant to be mindless fun, and I don't agree with that. I don't think that just because something is sugary sweet, I don't think that's something that shouldn't be able to be enjoyed unless you switch off your brain. I still think people have put Tolkien up on too high of a pedestal, and so they say that anything that has come since then is impossible to replicate and it's never going to be as good. And who cares? Like, it doesn't need to be as good. It can still be entertaining, as he says, just written by lesser writers, and there's nothing wrong with that. It can be tropey and still be fun. Martin himself has some tropes in his books, but he has done things in a way that make them interesting, if not always original. Although I will argue that his books have done things that nobody else has had the balls to do, like kill off beloved characters.
his ugly minions are coming out, and they're horrible minions because they're ugly and they wear black, and
Bad.
they have a lot
Super
of
bad.
Black is
spikes and
bad,
stuff on their armor, and
Mm-hmm.
spiky armor.
and the good guys go forth, and they're all like elves and stuff like that, and they're really pretty, and they wear white, and uh, the world is not that simple. Good guys and bad guys is fun when you're 7, but you should look around and see what the world is like and grow more than that. And I wanted to kind of reflect, to weld fantasy with the historical fiction, and which is more gritty and realistic, and to capture some of what I see as the real moral ambiguity of these issues, because real human beings are not. You can't tell the bad people because they're ugly or the good people because they're pretty.
That's very true.
And I deliberately turn some of these conventions on the head. I mean, the Night's Watch, yeah, they're a bunch of scum, but they're heroic scum,
I mean,
And they're
and
protecting.
yet they were black.
yes.
So
This is very
I was
interesting
doing
because
that.
you've got these guys who are technically bad guys. It's kind of like sending everybody off to the penal colony that was Australia. Well, imagine if Australia was the frontier border between us and another dimension where the monsters were coming through and they were going to destroy the planet. You know what I mean? Like it's kind of the equivalent of that, where you took these bad guys and you sent them off to this desolate place, but in that desolate place, they have a chance to redeem themselves by being the protection against whatever it is. So it's a catch 22 in the sense that they're still bad guys, but they're in a place technically doing good things even though they're bad dudes. It's very interesting. Like I said, he took a trope and he did something different with it.
And I took ravens, which of course in Tolkien and the imitators are these birds of ill omen and horrible things, and I made them basically a good thing, a means of flying from castle to castle and delivering messages and so forth. So
Often very
I
bad
was I
messages.
was deliberately playing with, and the guys in white, the Night's Watch, or not the King's Guard,
Kingsguard.
all wear white, but it's an institution that was once heroic but is now hopelessly corrupt,
Yeah,
full of political appointees and
bad dudes.
people who are venal or brutal or greedy and appointed for anything but the original reason. So I was playing with all of the tropes and turning a few things on their head.
So I think that's very important here. He talks about how I was playing with some of the tropes and turning things on their heads. So even Martin himself has gone in and taken things that would be considered tropey, and he did something that was unique and hadn't been seen at the time that he was writing A Song of Ice and Fire, and at the time that Game of Thrones was coming out on television. No one had seen that sort of brutality and originality done before because we'd been getting these sugary sweet carbon copies of Tolkien for so many years that people had kind of forgotten what it was like to see something original. And that's not to say that there wasn't original science fiction and original shows coming out, but I would argue that fantasy, by the time that, say, The Song of Ice and Fire had hit publishing, we'd been spending 50 years um, of people recycling, Lord of the Rings, and some of it good, some of it bad. I mean, you could look at, say, Terry Brooks and the Sword of Shannara. It had its unique elements, but it also had a lot of tropes to it. I've mentioned, Memory, Sorrow, and Thorn by Tad Williams also takes some fantasy tropes, but has a lot of original stuff to it. You could look at Raymond Feist's Rift War Saga. You can look at Terry Goodkin's Sword of Truth series. You can look at Robert Jordan's Wheel of Time series. These are just some of the ones I'm mentioning off the top of my head that all harken back to Tolkien at some point, but they have all done things that are somewhat unique, even though they are playing with the same tropes and sort of the same idea of, in some cases, a big bad guy or bad guy's minions, um, but still playing with things in a way that's a little bit different. And I think at the end of the day, um, one of the things that George R. R. Martin did with Song of Ice and Fire, because it's not finished, and I doubt he's going to finish it in his lifetime. I've ranted about that in my Rings of Power videos. Um, he did start off creating something very unique. I think it's gotten away from him in recent years. I think he spent most of his years toiling away, not being very famous and making a living, but that was about it. And then suddenly he got, you know, big and famous in his later years and said, you know what, I'm going to enjoy this while I can. And there's nothing wrong with that, to the detriment of us readers who have now been waiting more than a decade for the latest Song of Ice and Fire novel. But the one thing you can never take away from George R. R. Martin is that he did something with those early Ice and Fire books that no one had done before, and that was you blend fantasy with and I know there are other authors out there who have done this to varying degrees, but I would like to say that they didn't become as successful as A Song of Ice and Fire did, and the reason was I don't think they did it as well as Martin did. Because everybody says, oh, grimdark existed before Martin, and but be that as it may, um, the blending of medieval with, I would call it low fantasy. I don't think that Song of Ice and Fire is high fantasy because we're not dealing with as much magic as you would say, Wheel of Time or even Tolkien, where we have lots of magic happening. Um, this is definitely, there is magic, but mostly it's just about medieval grittiness and realism, and that's not a pretty place to live in. And if you go back to thinking about how brutal humanity has been over the centuries, the millennia, really, the tribalism and the way the kingdoms operated and the feudal nature and constant wars and bickering and battling and torture and not good conditions and people dying of really nasty diseases during war times and the mud and the blood and the grit and the grime and the maggots and the weevils and a lot of people have, in the fantasy genre specifically, have sort of glossed over the nasty, just really part of living in any sort of fantasy environment where there's not magic to heal wounds and get people cured, and there's not science and vaccines and, I mean, things like the bubonic plague and rats and rabies and bad teeth and dying because your fingernail got infected because you were building something and you smashed your finger with a hammer, and oh, you got a blood blister, and then that blood blister gets infected and then you die. Like, dying in childbirth, people dying, the ripe old age of 32, and it was not a pretty place, and I think that that's something that Song of Ice and Fire has done very well, is bringing that to the spotlight in a way that even Tolkien never did. Because as much as I enjoy the Lord of the Rings, and as much as I do put Tolkien up on a pedestal, I don't have him as high as other people, but I do love Tolkien, and he was the person who originally inspired me to become a writer, along with C.S. Lewis. Um, excuse me. I think that even Tolkien was creating something that was largely, it at least started off as something that was for children and did eventually grow into something that could be, more enjoyed by adults as well. But he was still dealing with something that had its dark moments, but it wasn't as visceral as George R.R. Martin writes, for better or for worse. Anyway, I just thought this was an interesting conversation. I'm going to be continuing to dig into stuff like this throughout 2023 because as we're doing our Mondays in Middle Earth and the reread of Wheel of Time and more George R. R. Martin stuff and book reviews and show reviews and beyond, I find these types of conversation fascinating as we continue to analyze, good fantasy, bad fantasy, good sci-fi, bad sci-fi, what's fun, what's not fun, why we should enjoy all of it regardless, and beyond. So if you like that kind of stuff, like, subscribe, hit that bell icon. Lots of ways to support, as you can see below. The easiest way is a membership here on YouTube or a super thanks on this video. Hopefully you'll stick around and have greater conversations with us in the comments below or over on Discord. Don't forget the Patreon page, and I'll see everybody in the next episode. Until then, folks, stay safe, happy reading, or viewing, whichever is your preference.